A próxima palestra falando sobre Mobilizando Comunidades. Convido a conselheira federal do CAU-BR, nossa mediadora, Leila Marques. Obrigada, Leila. Convido o senhor Illya Azaroff.
Good afternoon, my colleagues. Hello. I think you are not going to need this translator because my accent will give you a very good information what I'm talking. I think, and I hope Illya understand me. I'm sure you understand. Put my glasses. I'm not going to read his biography. I'm going to comment as an admirer, okay? And let me see. Just to give an opening to our special guest talk, I wanted to take a moment to highlight how critical urban resilience is, especially in countries like Brazil, which has over 8,000 kilometers of coastline. Our coastal cities are home to millions of people are increasingly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, rising sea levels, extreme weather events, flooding, and erosion. Am I right? Building resilience in these urban areas is not just about protecting infrastructure. It's about safeguarding lives, preserving livelihoods, and ensuring long-term sustainability. Your work, Illya, is a powerful reminder that we do not live in isolation, as you say. Cities are parts of broader ecosystems, natural and human, and the choice we make ripple outward, affecting others around the world. But advocating for resilience, you are also advocating for solidarity, empathy, and deep sense of shared responsibility that transcend borders. And I am very grateful you are here. When you say that we are not alone in this world, it resonates strongly, especially for nations like Brazil, with such ecological diversity and social inequality. One of the most compelling examples of Illya's impact is the Hurricane Strong Home. Of course, you're going to talk about. It's a resilient and passive design prototype that both sustainable and practical, built to weather storms, save lives, and cost only a fraction more than a typical home. Without further ado, with you, Illya Azaroff, please. Let's share.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be using the podium, if you don't mind, for my notes. It's great to be here. I want to thank Patricia and CAU for the invitation. It's my first time in Brazil, and so you must bear with me. You'll have to suffer through English from my standpoint, but it's just so beautiful to be here. The project that was mentioned, I will touch on it briefly, but really today we're going to talk about one very important thing, is how we as architects really understand the difference between healing and curing. And I'll talk about that in a few moments. But if we can go on to the next slide, please. So just a bit about my work. As was mentioned, I work all over the world, really responding to disasters and working with countries, nation states, communities, and groups. I work with a lot of indigenous peoples and really trying to understand that how we adapt adaptation and mitigation really is a partnership. It's really understanding who you are with the people you're with and their culture, their history, their heritage, and that uniqueness of place. Some of the stories I'm going to tell you today come from my office. Plus Lab Architect, we operate globally, partnering with a lot of local groups, as I mentioned. But my goal is to give greater voice and visibility to communities around the world. And secondly, to bring more hands and thought leaders like yourself in this room to this work. We have to do this work. There is no other choice. So when we really think about where we are going, I put a little outline together, but really focus on the right side of the slide. We have had COP conferences and community meetings and talks about professionals and architects, how we bring carbon down and fight climate and all of these impacts on our communities. Yet the global warming trend continues. It keeps going up and up and up. So what is the impact we have to have in the profession? In spite of all of the good work we're doing, how do we accelerate those things? And so what I do want to talk about is healing versus curing, because we all know how to cure. As an architect, an engineer, it's flooding, so we build a wall or we lift the building, right? But healing is more about a holistic view. It's how do we understand the whole, making something whole again, a community whole again, through the work that we do. And how do we include ecosystem services, understanding the partnership with nature, in addition to the great things that you already are doing out there. And maybe some of you are practicing this way. But for me, it's really understanding the storm that we are in. Because the storm that we are all in really is about this idea that we have to endure shocks and stresses. We have to understand that it's not just the tropical storms and the loss of ecosystems that we see going on all around the world. It's also the flooding and the drought that disrupts all the lives that we see, all the food production that is disrupted. We also see that the cascading effects, the causation, the extreme resource stress that we see in our communities, almost on a daily basis in the news. We also are seeing that earthquakes, not just earthquakes all around the world, are having effects on populations being moved or into other areas that stress out existing communities who are willing to help them. But just think about that resource stress. And of course, I don't have to tell you about wildfires. Wildfires in your country, in my country, in Canada, all over the world are becoming much more frequent. And that brings us to this idea of what are we losing in this process? Well, we're losing housing and infrastructure. We are also losing livelihoods. We are losing community. People are being torn apart when they're displaced. So when you begin to think about these things, it's not just these events, right? There's a big storm that comes or a major shock or stress, but it's these chronic issues. This is close to my neighborhood in New York City, where I'm from, and this is just three inches of rain in a 2-hour period. And so it's overwhelming, and it's happening a lot. But if we look at the Paris Agreement said, let's keep it at 1.5 degrees Celsius. We are at that level now. And when we signed that agreement globally, that meant 350 million more people would be exposed to these things that I'm showing you. So we knew this was going to happen. But what does that mean now that we are bumping up against that? We as architects have the ability to really make change. But this is the storm I'm describing, but what's the effect on our entire global community? Well, every minute of every day, 24 people are displaced around the world. So while I'm up here talking to you, thousands of people are being displaced, right? They're being displaced from natural and man-made disasters. And when you look at that, that's extraordinary. Last year alone, it was 120 million people displaced in a single year at the cost of 417 billion US dollars. And that's just reported physical loss. That is not the loss of business and income and how long your businesses are down. That is just insured losses. And remember, there's a lot of countries that do not require insurance, and there's a lot of places that do not insure their buildings. So this report is only that piece. What truly is that number is what's frightening. But if we look to the future in your practices, and you know when you build a building, you're building for tomorrow. So if we look at 2050, which is not that far away, we're going to have displacement globally at 200 million people on an annual basis. That is catastrophic. And that only increases unless you and I change that narrative. We build better, we build holistic communities, and we heal as we build. If we do that, we can not just stem the tide, we can change the narrative to a positive future. At least that's my dream, that's my hope, and I think we can get there. To really look at the science behind what is happening, these global catastrophes are really embedded in several reports, and many of them you've probably read, but they're affecting all of our communities. No one is immune around the world to some of these things that I'm showing you. And according to the IPCC report, I'm sorry, this is the one I was meant to show you. I'm behind on the slide. That is the global picture that I just had mentioned. And 2050 is where we are dwelling today. looking at that 200 million people on an annual basis. But the global impacts that we face really are affecting all of our communities. And it really is this IPCC report where you can draw the data that says 3 million people are your clients today. If there are 3 million plus people living in climate stress, that is your clientele right now. So where does the financing come from? I'll talk about that in just a minute. But those global changes, those global issues that we face, such as heat stress and water scarcity and food security and flood risk, all come hand in hand. It's never a singular something. When it floods, then food is at stress. When there's cascading effects such as heat, we lose crops. We also lose productivity. We lose economy. All of the supply chains, because you're all systems thinkers, you understand systems thinking. We have to track where our material comes from, how it's produced, how it's delivered, and account for it. Now think about that in a larger systemic scale, and this is what we're seeing in these cascading effects. So back to this idea of where do we start to draw on ecologies? One of the major pieces that we rarely get involved with as architects is the understanding of the other parts of those reports. Remember that Paris Agreement, 1.5 degrees Celsius? 1.5 degrees Celsius clearly stated that if we bump up against that, we are losing 70 to 90% of our global reef system at 1.5. Now that extra half a degree, when we go to 2 degrees, this is why the Paris report was telling us we need to cap this. But if we get to 2 degrees, it's a multiplier, 2 to 10 times the loss across all biodiversity. That is a killer for us. We have to do better. We have to do better in our work. In fact, over half of the global GDP relies on nature. So if it relies on nature, then how do we incorporate that into our projects? And 34% of the species out there are already on the endangered species list. But the one thing that you don't see here is that the entire global network of funding is a $33 trillion annual opportunity. That's what the Global Ecosystem Services produces today. And I'll show you where you can find that information. But let's get back to this idea of healing versus curing, because that is the question. And I'm going to show you how we can use some of these ideas into some of the work that we need to do for our communities. Because our communities must not just be resilient, they have to be adaptive. They also have to be ecologically diverse. They have to be able to handle all of the things that I'm showing you, and we collectively know how to do those things. We have to increase carrying capacity of the surrounding areas to make sure that those ecosystems support us all along. And because this is leading up to COP30 here in Brazil, it's important to understand the trajectory where we have gone, because there's good news. The good news is there is financing for this type of work. We've moved from completely adaptation funding across the world, decreasing carbon, decreasing global emissions, to an increase in adaptation towards those shocks and stresses, really bringing resilience forward. And now asset management has changed as of last year. At COP29, asset management, when you really look at a site and the surrounding area, you must now really understand that ecosystem services and biodiversity are part of your stock take. They're part of the way that you evaluate a site. If you are looking at funding from the World Bank or trying to achieve global initiatives for the SDGs, you have to incorporate that into your site. So what does that mean? That means coming into COP30, this is the implementation COP. How do we take this information and begin to implement that across everything that we do and collectively do that and arm our delegates to let folks know where we need to go further? Well, in fact, if we look at the SDGs, this idea of gross ecosystem product is now the piece that you're going to be seeing in those offerings. Okay. So the last piece of this part of the puzzle is really looking at COP15 and the idea that the financing that you can tap into is quite enormous. 4.5 trillion US dollars on an annual basis. That's your business opportunity if you're just looking at land and farming. and ecosystem restoration. So think about that. But this is our moment from COP15. So COP15 was the big change. In December of 2023 in Montreal, the Biodiversity COP put forward an idea that is a stock take of all of the ecosystem services, all of the forests, all of the amazing things happening in oceans all around the world. And what does that give us? What does that give the world? And change the trajectory from sustainability to one of regenerative design, to move towards abundance, to move towards an increase in natural systems in all of the work that we are doing at the nation state level, all the way down to a very small house, right? How do we do that? So to summarize, this is where you are very much needed. Architects are at the pinch point of this because we know what the global need is. It was even stated in the introduction. Your cities on the coast, your cities, your places where your communities are, they need architects to translate what those problems are into solutions and ideas. And the global funding is there. There's an enormous amount of funding from the World Bank and on the development side to bring those communities and make them whole again. What's missing is us as architects. There's not enough architects in the world to do the work that is necessary to meet these challenges. So think about that. This is our model today. If you think about adaptation and mitigation, they're two sides of the same coin. Yes, I have to reduce carbon, and yes, I have to protect people from shocks and stresses, from those storms, from those fires, from those things. And we've known that as architects. But what we now have to do is make sure that to be regenerative, to bring ecosystem services into all of your work is rather important. Through that, we create an equity that the world has only talked about for 100 years or 200 years. We bring equity to everyone because everyone has a role or a stake when ecosystem services are involved. So now I'm going to take you to those two stories that I wanted to talk about today. First is a learning moment for me on this trajectory to understand what regenerative design is. And it's just after the earthquakes in Turkey. So you all remember in March of 2023, there were an enormous amount of earthquakes throughout Turkey. This is the area that was affected. 11 cities across Syria and Turkey were devastated. And I was asked to go on behalf of the US government and start to work with those communities and bring them forward to see what the future may hold. And this is traditionally where over 2,000 years, there have been 8 major devastating earthquakes that have leveled the civilizations that were there. So naturally, the question to people who have lived there traditionally for thousands of years, well, do you relocate your cities? And the answer is no. Culturally, historically, this is where we are from. This is who we are. We understand the earthquakes, and the earthquakes have given us many positives over these centuries. Even in this time that I was there, you had families who had lost many people. We're talking about something that was purely unrecognizable to an outsider. Well, if there's a threat, then don't you move away from the threat in the recovery process. So in working with them, we understood this one thing. At these moments of disruption, rules no longer apply. Now this is with government policy, with where people traditionally would live, how transportation networks and systems work. When that happens, that moment of disruption is the moment where architects, systems thinkers, engineers can get together and co-design with communities and stakeholders to change the way it was to a better future. We're often straitjacketed by the rules of the 20th century, what you inherit in your office. Oh, well, this is the way we've always done it. No. What does innovation in the 21st century look like? What does it look like to regenerate or change something based on the historic past, the culture of place, and bring it to someone, somewhere that no one has ever seen but have dreamt of? That's what I learned from going to Turkey. The one missed opportunity working with the government and then the locals, the gap was the local communities wanted to bring back ecosystem services, restore their cities with more parks, open areas, and less density for when future earthquakes happen. The government was not interested in bringing parks. They weren't interested in doing this new type of infrastructure. at the very beginning. Now, 2 years later, that is starting to change because the communities have gotten a voice. But here's the major thing that I learned. This part of the world is the birthplace of the mosaic, because when their cities are destroyed, they use every piece of what was destroyed and build something new. And so when I was speaking with, in fact, this was a grade school principal, and I asked him, so how are you dealing with all of these influx of students who lost all their families? And he said, well, you know, we are the birthplace of the mosaic, and you must use every piece to put everything back together. That includes society, that includes economy, that includes who we are as a people. So in the aftermath of this, I had the opportunity to work with these kids. And most of these kids lost family. But they are the mosaic that they were talking about. These kids will be the future of that entire region. And their process in the co-design, they talked about what they wanted to see. They didn't lament about losing family, although you could see sadness. They talked about a future and were doing drawings of places that could exist if you begin to work as good systems thinkers and architects. So that is a lesson learned. Now I'll take you through one project in these last moments. And I know the Hurricane Stronghouse was mentioned. I'm going to take you to a larger scale because this is about urbanism. And I wanted to take something to a place where I'm working with indigenous people in the Pacific Ocean. This is in Hawaii. This is the Ko'alaloa Community Resilience Hub. And this is the community I work with. This is a collection of 7 native communities all across the north shore of Oahu. The town in the center of it is called Hauula and was the cultural center for thousands of years, pre-colonial era. And it's still a village today, surrounded by a lot of farming community, and the fisheries have already collapsed, so all of the fishing has left. In fact, a lot of the children, once they become adults at age 19, there is no economic opportunity, so they all leave. And they don't come back until they're about 34 or 35 because they want to raise their families there, in the beauty of that place, in the cultural heritage of where they've come from. And that is a really important piece to how you design for regenerative thinking. But let's take a step back. As an architect, we have to really look at what the site is. We began to analyze the whole region. And this is the town of Hauula on the shore, and you can see that we looked at impacts of hurricanes and tropical storms. And you can see category 1 through 4. You can see the town really heavily affected by those circumstances. And that little green rectangle is where our project is going to be located, or is underway now. We looked at all of the science and data that was available, whether it was through our national organizations and FEMA, to look at future risks, projecting 500 years into the future. And we also looked at tsunami risk and earthquakes. The extreme tsunami zone is from those underwater earthquakes, and you can see here, we're just have a piece of our site, the very upper portion just outside of it. So in other words, we're doing an all-hazard assessment. And in this whole area, you may find this interesting because you probably have public shelters for people for emergencies and storms and things like that. This entire geography, this region inside the United States, 26,000 residents over miles and miles and miles, has no shelters, no public shelters for any of the storms that I'm talking about. None. So that is where we started this conversation. They also have a food security issue. It is a farming area, but you can't afford to buy the food that's being produced across the street from you because the economy is so poor. So think about that. Energy is always an issue because there's power outages even when there's blue skies. And I showed you those maps of the hurricanes. A Category 1 hurricane will affect 85% of the housing. So 26,000 people, 85% of them have no place to go if that storm is coming. And after the storm, how do you reoccupy, right? There's flooding in blue skies, high tide, full moon, all of these things. So the way that we take this on to really incorporate and embrace the community is bringing the workshops together, finding all the stakeholders, the people who were expatriates who moved away. We invited them all to come back. Why did you leave? Why is your family not here? Government officials, police, fire, medical teams from the area, all of the traditional families, the elderly that talk story about the history of the place, and as many of the youth as we could bring. And over the course of a month, we came forward with this whole series of agreed upon goals. The first goal was not, I want my family safe. In that aspect, the first thing was family has a gathering place. And then they talk about everything about a healthy community. I want my community to be healthy. I want medical services that we don't have here. I want to be able to have self-sustaining abilities. These seem to be something that we all have a right to have, but here's a community, and many communities all across that area that don't have a sense that they can accomplish this on a daily basis. So here's those identifying markers. We also had communities really place their programs and choose what they want to have as part of the entire project. And once you go through this process, they started to add things that we never thought about. They said, well, you have to have all of these other elements. They wanted to have traditional plants for traditional medicines. They wanted to have agroforestry, agropharma. They wanted to be able to grow food on the site, propagate and give plants out to others. And so what that came to is that, you know, the community really has a face. And if the community that you work with really comes forward, here's one thing that Dottie said, this community has not had a voice. We've not been visible to government. We've not been visible to anyone. And we need a place to get together, to cry, to laugh, to just be a community so we can build those bonds that are so essential for success in the future. And the youth of the community, when you're asking them what they were looking for, they were saying that when we think about sustainability, it's about sustaining our life and their culture. So culture became one of the biggest drivers of this project, even though we showed them all of the hazards they face. They said, hey, we know that. We live that every day. But culturally, we need that to be preserved. How do we maintain the culture of place? And then here, this is the last quote I'll give you from Ronnie. We may be poor, but we're rich in our culture. That's why we still hang on, why we still do what we do. We fight for the next generation so they don't forget their culture. This became more of, instead of a disaster relief shelter, this became a cultural center that regenerates culture, but also takes care of many of the issues that I illustrated we're facing. And through that process, we had a lot of what's called talk story. You talk to the historians, which are the oldest family members of every family, and they tell you about the history of the Polynesian people, all of the indigenous practices that have been left on the sideline or ignored, indigenous wisdom. So 2 design ideas came forward. For Native Hawaiians, your relationship to the land and the water and family are your 3 major things. That's your life. So one is about the land, which I'll talk to in a second, and the other one is about considerations for the building. The building was based on a story that was told to me by the elders. They said that when traveling, they would flip the canoe over on new islands and harbor under it when those storms would come. And so the building itself is based on indigenous practices. This is based on a va'a, which is a traditional canoe, flipped over, and you harbor your family on the inside. This is a shelter that meets FEMA 361 guidelines. Oh, sorry, that didn't turn out. Meets FEMA 361 guidelines. Near absolute protection, can be off the grid for 30 days. It harvests rainwater, grows food around it, and can have 1,500 people, I think I mentioned. So this is an extraordinary example of taking indigenous wisdom and marrying it to the great science that all of you understand as architects and engineers. So we are not ignoring the past, we're actually harvesting the greatest resource that we have, is taking a community, bringing it forward, and translating their ideas so the government can look at it and say, oh, we'll fund that, even though they've been fighting for it for 20 or 30 years. So we worked with the Department of Energy to get to the 30 days off-grid, modeling the house, doing everything, or modeling the building, everything that many of you do in your offices or aspire to do. We made sure that this building came forward to do this. Now, the second part is the relationship to the land. And I think it's important that we understand the native practices and why they were done. Hawaii has a torrential rain season and then a dry season. And the native Hawaiians for thousands of years would harvest the water, use it for plant growing, use it for everything possible, keeping themselves safe and enhancing the ecosystem services around them, growing more food than they could eat. So our team volunteered. There's me in the center with all of our engineers volunteering to understand how these systems work. They're restoring these systems now in Hawaii as good practice for ecological use and understanding how that environment's changing. It was a great series of days, and I learned a great deal, and that became part of the design process. And in fact, our building is now seen as part of the environment. The design has been accepted not just by the native Hawaiian communities, but by the local government to see how we build for the 21st century in their environment using the culture of place. The invasive species covered our 5-acre site. There's most of the islands, if you go to the Pacific, those islands are covered with invasive species. We cleared 5-acre site and there was only 5 trees in 5 acres that were native species. So there's the site after it's been cleared. And there's very few trees left. But the good news is that we have to heal this place, we work with the Nature Conservancy, and all of the native plants are being replanted onto the site. It'll be the first site in the North Shore of Hawaii that has native plants that are producing food, producing the right ecosystems for that area. And so we're enhancing this place. I know I'm running out of time, so I do want to talk about who's on your design team. So in a regenerative process, you can start to see leveraging indigenous wisdom and understanding ecosystem services, but also the talent. This is Tuoni, one of the master carvers who lives in Hauula, and he has wanted to open a carving school. So part of our building will have a new carving school for the youth. So the youth will learn some trades and start to look at a different economy. They've also decided to start that carving school early. They started it last year on our site, and they are going to be carving the whole interior of the project for us. All of the elements that are coming in are going to be from local wood that has been downed in the forest, not fresh cut. All of the things removed from the forest to keep it safe from fire will be used to carve the interior of our project. And then all these partners came forward. I won't go through all of them, but once you start to do a process like this, your team changes and your partners change. People have come forward saying, we want to be part of this. We recognize you're doing something that no one is doing. So the whole idea of community and the way it connects outward is completely changed. And this community is now visible. We're using spiritual liaisons, horticulturalists, native healers, reef restoration specialists, archaeologists, and cultural leaders. They're all on our design team. They have design meetings with us to look at the drawings we're doing, but they're also telling us where we need to go with this project. And it has been wildly successful. So remember community when you're doing your work, and remember those pieces. And the last piece that I'll show you here, this is I believe the second to last slide. If you're really interested in the ecosystem services and how you finance your projects, there it is. There's $26 trillion in ecosystem service financing that is out there that was launched at COP15 2 years ago. It will be talked about at this COP at 30 of how that is in your projects, how cities and states can really get a hold of this funding to do the work we need to do. So think about regenerative design. And then, of course, regenerative materials. This is from one of our great partners with AIA, one of the wonderful institutes of Living Futures. And they have been on top of this for several years. This is a new publication they had out last year to how do you get regenerative products into your design process. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much. I'm heading to Alaska in a few weeks. We're starting to work with the Eyak tribe in a similar regenerative process. They were given land back from mining that was stolen from them, and instead of that company repairing the damage to the environment, they closed their company and left it. So the US government gave it back to the native peoples and said, it's yours now. Well, now I have acres and acres, thousands of acres of destroyed land, and so they've asked me to come and start working with them. How do we regenerate this entire place for the 4 Eyak tribes that are there? So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that.